You know that when you expose blood to air, very quickly it congeals. It clots. Therefore, the first transfusions had to be live, donor to recipient. Direct transfusion, because there was no way to bank that blood. There was no way to keep that blood fluid. And so, although the problem had been solved as to the blood type, you still couldn't use it in an emergency basis. You couldn't use it in the operating room. You couldn't use it in a battlefield unless you had a live donor immediately on the spot. But then enter Richard Lewison, whom you see in your left-hand upper corner. Lewison was a researcher who had been working with blood, and he knew that you could keep blood liquid using sodium citrate. But when you use the same blood and you gave it to an experimental animal, the animal died. It went into kidney failure. So he began to experiment, and after several years, he determined that the safe concentration of citrate to use was 0.2% in blood. Wonderful. Now we had blood that could be saved and could be used on demand in the operating room, in the theatrical theater of obstetrics, in the emergency room, maybe even in a battle situation. But that problem was ultimately solved by the next individual you see up here, and that's Richard Drew. Because Drew said there has to be a way to store blood in large amounts. And he worked on it, and sure enough, he gave us the improved method of storing blood, separating plasma and blood. And look when, 1940, just in time for a terrible war. I'm sure you all recall those iconic photographs of the medic, the GI medic with his helmet, kneeling before a fallen comrade, holding up a bag of plasma as he's administering life-saving, that golden hour fluid to that individual who's just fallen in battle. Why was that possible? Richard Drew. We finally come to a point now where transfusion was a reality. But wait, that's just the beginning. Stop and think about it. We can now store blood. You can store 1 jar, 3 jars, 5, 10, 20 jars. What can you do with 20 jars of blood? You can put it in a bypass machine. You can put it in a dialysis machine. You can put it in an ECMO machine, extracorporeal oxygen membranation for babies, for adults with lung disease. You could do a whole host of things because you can now store blood. I would venture to say that in this audience right now, at least half of you have already had a cardiac cath. And perhaps 10% of you have had bypass. And perhaps 2% of you have had carotid endarterectomies done to prevent strokes. All of these procedures were possible because of Carl Landsteiner, Richard Lewison, and Richard Drew, who gave us the ability to store and save blood. But folks, it gets better. In 1903, Willy Einthoven knew of the early experiments in bioelectricity. He knew that they had started with the frog, thus the title that I hope brought you into the auditorium, the frog, because Luigi Galvani had been experimenting with the frog. He had prepared a biological specimen of excoriated legs of a frog with the nerve exposed. And he realized through experimentation that every time the crural nerve of the frog, the crural nerve is the equivalent of our femoral nerve that runs down the length of the leg and innervates our leg, that every time he touched that nerve with a little source of electricity, the limp leg suddenly jerked up. Every time. So he knew he had a concept of bioelectricity. Alessandro Volta took up the same study, and he further refined this whole concept of bioelectricity. Now we had a source of energy They still didn't understand the concept of electricity, of course. That was a much later term, because what was it that they used to create electricity? Do you remember now? They took a piece of amber, and they would rub amber on a woolen cloth to produce what we now call static electricity, and perhaps many of you also call static cling. Well, that kind of electrical activity, static electricity, was generated by the use of amber. And what is the Greek word for amber? Electron. So it's given us the name, of course, for electricity. Now, this study was then picked up by Lippmann, who said if there's electricity that can stimulate the extremities and make it contract, the heart's a big muscle that's constantly thump, 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 thump. He says there has to be electricity there too. So he started working on animal hearts. And sure enough, he found that the pattern was different. Instead of the spike activity of a single contraction of a muscle, he found that there was convex spiking in the heart. And Waller said, I bet you this is also true with the human. But of course, you couldn't dissect the human to study the heart. So what did Waller do? He started using brine electrodes, solutions of brine. And this was observed by Einthoven, Wilhelm Einthoven. And Einthoven had one advantage over Waller. He had been experimenting with the galvanometer, a way to actually measure and quantify electrical current. And more than that, he was working with the ability to record it using a chymographic system. So here you see a picture of Einthoven's EKG. Now, you've all had electrocardiograms done, right? You go to the doctor's office very simply. They put an electrode on each arm, one on each leg. They strap them across the chest. This tiny little box, then in 20 seconds, makes a wonderful electrical record of your heart activity and tells you very simply whether your heart is normal or abnormal. It's been miniaturized. Everything has been miniaturized thanks to the discovery of the transistor. We got rid of the big vacuum radio tubes that would occupy a whole room, and we've reduced it to a tiny little box. That's the beauty of the modern physics of electron transfer and induction. But it's still the same principle. You're measuring, as this individual has got his arm in brine and his leg in brine, and he's recording the activity of the heart. Now, Einthoven then gave us the ability to recognize when the heart was beating abnormally. So think about it, folks. In 3 short years, we've gone to safe transfusions, and now we've got the ability to understand and record the incipient beginning of heart disease. We don't understand it all yet. It's a little too early. But boy, what progress has been made. And it's been on the shoulders of people coming over and working and experimenting over the years. So what did the frog give us? The lowly frog, with the work of Galvani and the experimentation with the disarticulated legs, has given us Einthoven's EKG. This, by the way, is Einthoven's original EKG, the actual first one that he recorded. And it's remarkable, at least to me, because there's no difference essentially between the one he made in 1903 and the one we make today. I will show you an illustration of a modern one compared to Einthoven's, and you will see that it remains basically the same. So, from the concept of bioelectricity, where has it taken us? Remarkably, we now have pacemakers. I'm sure there are several of you in this audience sitting there with a wonderful little pacemaker, and you can thank Mr. Einthoven for that. We've got cochlear implants. We're now taking infants, children born deaf, and we're implanting an electronic cochlear just behind the ear so that they can learn to hear. We have spinal implants for people who have difficulty with transmutation of electrical impulses down the spine and impulses to their muscles, all driven by a pacemaker. We have automatic defibrillators. I'm sure there are several of you in the audience who are walking around with an implanted defibrillator. And what's in the future? Well, right now, the big research is in an artificial retina for people born congenitally blind. Who do we owe all this to? The little frog who gave us the concept of bioelectricity. So the next time you guys are in a park and you're walking by a pond and you hear a friendly little frog croak at you, turn around and say, thank you.